Thanks again for inviting me. I'm always happy to talk about this stuff. I wanted to introduce myself a little bit here. I actually do quite a few things besides look at cybersecurity. I'm currently an assistant professor at ASU, where I do other things like actually try to look at human attention. My background is pretty deep in cognitive psychology, so despite the fact that I would almost never label myself a psychologist, that's what all my degrees are. But I really feel like the application of those principles, as Matt alluded to, makes me more of a human factors engineer. And certainly I've gotten experience working with the military and lots of things like that, very applied stuff. So I've certainly picked up all the skills and trappings of more HFES type stuff. But some of the major things that happen here, we look at human attention in a lot of different facets, and I think cyber can be one of them. We also look at human AI and robot teaming. I'm currently the associate director of the Center for Human AI Robot Teaming here at ASU. We have a lot of different work, but certainly one of the major things that we're looking at is people's trust in different types of tools and various types of AI algorithms and things like that, which is a bustling area for activity. So we're interested in improving that. But this last bit has been something that's arisen over the last, I'd say, 6 or 7 years. Starting in 2015 or so, I got really interested in cybersecurity and the fact that it felt like, and I think the evidence has played out since then, that psychological study in terms of how people are doing their jobs, what it is they're actually doing, sort of user interface stuff, experimentation, testing, what could be improved, all that good sciencey, human factors-y kinds of things in cybersecurity really weren't happening. And of course, we started that with looking at defenders. And so certainly there had been work prior to that, but not very much of it. And I still haven't seen a ton, but there's certainly way more now than there was 7 or 8 years ago. And as we started studying that, we got interested in saying, hey, wait a second, who are these people that are trying to come in and break into the networks? And so one of the things we started getting interested in was disrupting the attacker decision-making cycle. But we also have some work looking at reverse engineering and trying to figure out how people who do that work identify potential vulnerabilities. And that's a current DARPA project that we have. So we're diversifying in cybersecurity. My students will tell you there's a lot going on in the lab. But I'm really happy to talk today about more of this decision-making stuff. And it does have a big psychological component. So title slide. We based this idea initially on thinking through stuff that had been revealed by Danny Kahneman. So I don't know if you guys have read this, but I know that Matt I think has shown this book cover before, and lots of people do. It's a very famous book about how people make decisions from the only psychologist to ever win a Nobel Prize. Of course, they don't award those in psychology. They give them out for economics, and that's what he got it in. But Danny Kahneman is a very famous thinker in this area. And there's sort of a question about whether or not cyber attackers or anybody like that actually does make these kinds of reliably emerging decision-making mistakes. And certainly the assumption from a psychologist like myself is always like, yes, of course, they're people. But there are a lot of folks that look at these attackers, or they look even at the defenders and say, wait, these people are hyper trained, like they're ultra smart, they're different, they're better, right? They're like this advanced human that, of course, they wouldn't make those kinds of mistakes. And I just don't think that's true. But you do have to go looking for evidence that that's the case. So we started this project with the idea that we thought there's very high likelihood that attackers make these mistakes, but we actually do have to do some analysis to reveal evidence that they do. And so these are my colleagues, Kimberly Ferguson-Walter at the Lab for Advanced Cybersecurity Research, and Sunny Fugate at NIWIC, or the Naval Information Warfare Center, which you recognize the logo. If you've been around a while, you might recognize that as the old SPAWAR logo because they changed their name several years ago, which was also where I worked when I worked for the Navy. So I don't think I have to harp on this issue too much, but it is important to recognize that one of the challenges in cyber is simply the enormous amount of potential targets and also the enormous amount of outcomes from hacking in or causing issues at those targets. So it's everything from loss of privacy to loss of life. And as technology increases and touches everything, now even your car could be a potential target for this. And it's kind of odd to me, as someone who studies things like trust, how someone might fall asleep in one of these things on the highway. But nonetheless, these become yet another thing that somebody has to worry about and protect. And of course, there's just a very big asymmetric disadvantage. And so people always ask this question, how can we stop attacks, or how can we disrupt attacks? And the solution is often technical. People will tell you, oh, well, to protect these Teslas, they update the software, they do some testing on that, they try to make these things secure, and that's all well and good. But they don't necessarily think through the psychology of the person that might be attempting to hack or attempting to disrupt the operation of this vehicle. And so, that kind of got us thinking about, no one's really studying in a scientific sense these attackers. And people will talk about goals and behavior and all these other things. So we all know the psychology is relevant, but we haven't really been trying to disrupt the psychology. And certainly there's a good reason for trying to do this. So the cyberspace environment in general is a big human system environment. And what I mean by that is it's managed and run by people, but you could easily get the impression that it's all technical, it's all software, it's all just code in the matrix, and that somehow people aren't involved. And yet, we know from studying defensive cybersecurity that there's actually quite a bit of psychological stuff going on, and some of that plays into the fact that there is an asymmetrical disadvantage. So what I mean by that is, because defenders sit on something and they're worried about people coming in, and attackers have the ability to just attack when they feel like it, any time of the day or night, with an infinite number of goals and abilities, the defensive job is pretty rough. And it's rough in a psychological way, not just in a literal, amount of work to be done. People recognize it as a difficult job. It's never ending. There's no, sort of final, like, oh, your job is done. Like, we fully secured the network and there's no more work to do. It can be limited by software. The fact that you can't see all the time what's going on, and all your capabilities have particular limits and limitations to them. The training in this area, we always know we need to staff more people and they need to be better trained. And it's definitely less flashy. So the kinds of people that it attracts in the defensive side is different. So these are all, this is a very much a psychological factor, right? And so we recognize that even the defense side isn't fully realized. So it's kind of hilarious that we're interested in the attacker side. But these are the same types of psychological things that we were interested in and curious about. Certainly attackers trying to spend enormous amounts of time and energy trying to get into something also are limited by the tools they have. There's some kinds of feedback, and I think that might be one of the biggest differences, is that as you make progress in a network, you actually do get wins and successes that are very clearly defined and have very, sometimes even profitable outcomes. And so that leads these people to feel much more confident, whereas the defenders may feel like, well, I have no idea and I just have to assume that nothing is ever fully secure. An attacker can say, hey, I just stole the credentials for this and now I'm on my way, or I installed this backdoor, or whatever it is. So how do we fix this asymmetrical disadvantage problem? And of course, lots of people have tried to come up with solutions to this. And I'm not saying that we've solved it, but I think we may be on the path to figuring it out. Whoops, that's the wrong key. All right. Yeah, we want to disrupt the attacker. That's all that slide says. So how do we actually do it? It's interesting because most of the ways people think about this in terms of the tech is actually affecting the psychology. So today, when we think about disrupting attackers, we actually use a lot of cyber deception to some extent. This could be everything from putting decoys on the network to using honeypots, anything that helps distract attackers from real assets and content, provide some sort of incorrect understanding of the network topology, or in other words, create confusion and frustration. And why do we care about doing that? Well, the idea is that not only does this potentially reveal attackers' goals, which then lets the defender change their strategy, but it slows them down, it might waste resources, and it certainly increases human error and fatigue. If you're attempting to break into something and you're constantly met with a problem and a thing that you think should work and it doesn't, and you get stuck on that and you try it over and over and over again, and now you're angry, and now you're questioning yourself, like, did I set this tool up correctly? Do I actually know what's going on? Maybe I didn't learn this as well as I thought I had, or maybe the advanced team didn't do the thing they're supposed to do, and why can't it, why doesn't it work? All that stuff, if we believe any of it is effective, which I think people do, we're essentially disrupting the psychology of the attacker. And yes, there is a technical reason why if you put your foot into a honeypot, we know more information about you and can potentially combat that. But the simple threat of those assets being on networks and the simple threat of being detected does weigh on attackers. So it really suggests that this attacker cognition matters a lot. And there's a question about why are we allowing them to sort of have undisrupted interactions with the network? And, you could argue that some tech is specifically trying to limit that. Maybe I detect that you're connecting through something that I don't want you to, and I terminate the connection. But again, from the cognitive standpoint, you may not always want to kick everybody out. You may actually want to allow some action in your network so that you can understand what the goals are, what the motivations are, and potentially even the source. So thinking through how you want to do that without allowing them to do anything is sort of a tough problem. And I just want to acknowledge that. It's certainly been attempting to be tackled for many, many years. So the idea that we came up with in the end is this concept that we termed oppositional human factors. So human factors is largely this study of making things easier to use by understanding the humans and their abilities. And you can see in this triangle sort of how systems might be built in order to do that. Hancock et al. Is basically saying, the basis of any good system is some type of safety. So the system has to have the prevention of pain. And, this comes from things like ergonomics where, if you're using your mouse hurts your hand, it's kind of like, well, I don't care what other cool features it has. I'm not going to use it. As soon as things are safe, then you care a lot about functionality. And of course, a lot of stuff that we interact with, like software, tends to be on this level. We care about what it can do. Does it meet the need? Does it help us achieve goals? But then more and more people care about the usability of that. Like how it achieves the goal matters. Is it easier to use than other things that might help, might eventually achieve goals, but I don't want to do all that extra work? And then really good products will actually incorporate some amount of pleasure and even individuation, meaning this is like exactly what you want, not just what a group of people who are doing your job want, but like you. And there's a lot of this in cybersecurity in some sense, because people will, starting from functionality, actually build their own tools to do certain tasks. What we're saying with this oppositional idea is that all the techniques that help us get to this point, a lot of them can actually be flipped on their head. So things that make items more usable, for example, can actually be turned around. And one of the best examples of this is actually Chris Notter's work, and it's kind of the dark designs. So he points out that the 7 deadly sins are actually a pretty good metaphor for turning people to do things that maybe they don't necessarily want to do, like make purchases on your website. You can actually use a lot of dark design patterns to, in a sense, disrupt the functionality and usability of a system, because the person doesn't actually want to come onto your website and buy something, but you can get them to do it anyway. And so this, again, gave us fuel for the fire for thinking about, well, attackers don't necessarily want to be caught, but given the right set of circumstances, they may make a decision error, or they may reveal their intentions more than they decided to. And the question is, how exactly can you turn all these things around? And so I want to pause for just a second and mention everything to this point is very theoretical, and I think it has a good basis. It's a good jumping off point. But the work that we've actually been doing is less so in this area and more so in actually seeing if attackers fall prey to some of these types of disruptions. If we create a scenario in which somebody has the opportunity to be biased in their decision making, do they actually fall for that? And can we sort of operationalize that in a way that gets a defender a good outcome? Because it's not just about disrupting the feedback that an attacker gets or the ability for them to use their tools easily or something like that. I think that's a good step. But we want to do this predictably as well. Chaos is useful, but a predictable change in attacker behavior is even better. So back to this idea of thinking fast and slow, we decided to focus on decision-making in particular. There's lots of other things, and we have some papers out there talking about distraction and things that could be, particularly good to disrupt attackers with, but decision-making in particular is an interesting one. And so if you're familiar with the Kahneman idea of decision-making, there's sort of a system one, system two perspective. And the idea here is that when you're faced with the decision, the first system activates, and it's really good at making good decisions when there's not much time, and the kind of decision that you're making doesn't have to happen with a lot of conscious awareness. It tends to be a really automatic sort of knee-jerk reaction. And the kinds of decisions that this works really well with tend to be everyday decisions. So really basic math and things that are not tricky in any way. We often use this system to think heuristically about challenges in decision making. So even things like buying a new car, you might look over at system two and say, well, actually, the last time I bought a car, I had to think a lot. It was actually pretty hard. I had to compare a whole bunch of stuff. It took me a long time. I had to go see the dealers. I had to, actually reason through financing and all these other things. And well, in the end, I made a really good decision and bought a nice car. At the same time, I could pull you back to system one and say, actually, if you know your budget and you know your color and you don't care about anything else, you can actually use what's called take the best heuristic. Use two properties out of the 10,000 that you might find when you're buying cars, and just make the decision based on that. Here's a car that's only costs $22,000 and it's red. Done. And you just avoid all of this extra effort, and you're probably still likely to make a decent decision. On the other hand, from a science standpoint, when we look at people making one-type decisions, there are some kinds of errors that are particularly likely to occur. If you haven't seen this problem before, it's a very famous problem proposed by Kahneman and Tversky about a bat and a ball cost $1.10, and the bat cost $1 more than the ball. So how much does the ball cost? And the first system activates when you try to answer that question, and you go, oh, well, it must be 10 cents, right? Bat and a ball, $1.10, bat costs $1, ball costs 10, must be done here, right? And unfortunately, that's incorrect. And the only way that you're going to figure that out is by letting the system 2 activate and double check this answer, because if you do sort of the algebra and you say, hey, wait a second, if I actually put $1 in for that bat and 10 cents in for the ball, if a bat costs $1 more than the ball, then actually the total now is $1.20. And that's wrong. So we have these intuitions and these heuristics that are largely very effective, except every once in a while they're wrong. And this is a systematic failure. And they found this across lots of different kinds of people and lots of different kinds of places. And it didn't seem to matter a whole lot about educational status or anything like that. It's very hard to learn your way out of this unless you've seen this problem before. And even then, and I probably covered this 100 times between classes and studying things and presenting this work. And yet still intuitively, the first thing that comes to mind is still 10 cents. It just feels so good. So again, the question is, what kinds of things in cybersecurity, and especially in the hacker world or attacker or whatever you want to call them, what kinds of things and decisions are made in that realm? Things that are fast, unconscious, automatic, assumed, things that happen all the time, things that may end up having these very predictable kinds of errors, wherein if we set up the problem correctly, they will make a mistake. And that's been, in a lot of ways, that is the overarching goal of this work. And unfortunately, I'm not able to present some of that today, but we will talk about other things that are related. And similarly, we are still interested in the system 2 reasoning because just like with thinking about anything else, just because you took your time and it may have taken some effort doesn't mean you made a good decision. And in fact, people make pretty systemic errors and logical fallacies, and things like confirmation bias, for example, which we'll cover here in a minute, is an example of somebody only seeking the evidence that aligns with their current worldview. It's a huge problem in intelligence analysts. It's a huge problem really for everybody, for every human, and you see it in all facets of life. And so regardless of whether they're doing things fast or doing things slow, we think there are patterns about the ways that people make mistakes. And the question is, what are those patterns in cyber? And particularly, what are those patterns in attackers, such that you may either increase the chance that they do this, or at least show that they do and therefore know that some aspect of your system creates this. And these are impediments, right? Because if you do this fast decision and you put in $1 and you're wrong, how long is it going to take you to figure out that you're wrong? Here, it's basic math. But in a more complicated example, it may take you an hour. And so we've slowed the attacker down. And similarly, if you start confirming what you believe over here, you may never test something that you should. And again, that can really disrupt things like strategic attempts at breaking into places or even just trying to avoid detection. So these are important categories of things, and I think all of this is a good metaphor for thinking through decision making. So this covers a little bit of what I just said, but certainly we're not just interested in exploiting both of the systems, but we actually think we might be able to force or exploit transitions between them. For example, getting people to switch from the fast to the slow may be really beneficial. I mentioned earlier that a lot of technology is based on this idea that you want to slow people down. Can we get people sort of lured into the, wait, you shouldn't just go with your answer. You should actually check it. You might be wrong. And even when it's unnecessary. We might be able to cause attackers to question valid heuristics. We might be able to lure them into applying logical fallacies on this system 2 side. So there might be reasons to try to push people to one side or the other. Similarly, if we have an attacker that is making very slow, conscious, very careful decisions, pushing that person to start making faster ones might make them more subject to rash judgments. They may be more susceptible to some of those heuristics failing, and they might even be able to rationalize that. So we have an example coming up that kind of shows that that can happen. But again, it's not just to leave people in one or the other, because one thing that the Kahneman example doesn't always illustrate immediately to people, even though Kahneman himself is very clear about this, is that people do transition between these two. It's not as if it's just a one-way only or one-side only process. There's absolutely movement back and forth. And of course, it's very difficult from a science perspective to track that as people do tasks in the lab and even in the real world. And it's less important really to know which system they're in and more important to know what kinds of mistakes they're making. So that should give you some background on that. So to kind of put a lot of this in perspective, I want to talk about some work that had been done previously, but that we were able to get our hands on and look for attacker behaviors that actually met some of these decision-making kinds of things. There's a paper published several years ago. Of course, this work itself was happening just a couple of years after this, in which a team of red cyber experts, so these are people who have a lot of experience doing sort of attacker-like activity, perform adversary emulation. This is essentially red teaming. If you're not familiar with that, they're acting like the bad guys. And this is happening in the context of cyber deception. So these people are brought in, they're given access to a network, they're not just like put on it, right? They're asked to break in and take things and do stuff. They're able to use their tools, they're able to work together. So basically this is an analogous attacker group of people. And one of the cool things that they did in this work was they actually had transcripts of all the communications and all the people talking. And one of the things that it sort of allows us to do is get our minds inside of theirs. You can kind of see what people are thinking and why they're doing certain things, in addition to they actually collected, actions on the network and things they got into versus didn't, things like that. All the stuff you would expect that an experiment would measure. So the experiment itself had 3 different deception phases. In phase 1, what they did is they actually put deceptive elements on the network that these people were trying to break into, but of course they didn't tell them this. So they didn't tell any of the participants that there was actually deception there. There just was. And you might think about this like, this is a pretty realistic situation. We're probably not going to tell the attacker that we're doing this stuff, but we certainly want it there, and it's supposed to be this blue team advantage. So the defenders get some extra intelligence there. In phase 2, however, they were very interested in this experiment to see what happens when you tell people about it. So now the attackers know that there's some type of deception present, and of course there actually is. And they monitor to see what happens in that phase. And then in this 3rd phase, all of it goes away. So there is no longer any deception. There's nothing bad on the network. It's all real systems. But they're not told that. They're not told that there is deception either. They're just allowed to think whatever they're thinking. You got to recognize that there's stuff that has the potential to carry over in terms of psychology, right? There's just some basic psychology about, if I was just in a condition where you told me there was deception and I saw some of it in action, if you say, hey, welcome to day 3, you're going to continue your work in breaking into this network, what are you going to think? You're certainly not going to just blank slate your mind and forget all this stuff that has happened previously. So this is one of the things that they're interested in as well. This has ramifications, and I don't have time to go into all of that, but it takes money and time to set up these kinds of deceptive elements on networks, and so the idea that you have to always have them up, and again, there's a question about whether you tell people that they're potentially there, and what kind of influence that has on attackers and their success rates and persistence and all these things is very important. So certainly go check out the paper for that. But for our purposes, we're just interested in what people are thinking along the way. And what we found is some really great examples of bias-like behavior. And so I'm going to take you through parts of the experiment and try to identify here in the phase and what people are trying to do, and show you the types of either heuristics or actual type of cognitive biases that we think we found evidence for. And then after we go through this, I'll very briefly conclude with some thoughts on that and some directions for the future in this area. So here we are, and we're in the 2nd phase. So remember, this is a phase in which in the first one, there was deception, but nobody knew for sure. In the second one, there's deception, and people were told. And what we find is that the attackers really started attempting to note useful characteristics for distinguishing real systems from those that might not be. So they start focusing on this. And when you think about it, that's a pretty good idea, right? I mean, nobody's calling them stupid for trying to figure out, hey, wait a second, I don't think this machine is real. Maybe we shouldn't touch it. We should only be focusing on the real stuff. And so it's a pretty good risk avoidance strategy. However, what happens is the way they try to figure out what's real versus decoy, and now think about this from a computer perspective, how many different traits does a machine have compared to another machine? It's not just 1 or 2. And if you're trying to say, hey, I think this is a decoy, this is a fake thing someone set up to look real, versus this is a real machine operating in the real world, that can get really tricky. And so what the attackers end up doing in this case is using some faulty logic, but they're doing a take the best type heuristic. I mentioned you could do this for car sales, right? I just price and color and I'm done. Well, it turns out that what the attackers do in this case is they look at the names on the machines and they look at the corporate directory on this network, and they just assume that machines named for people on the corporate directory. So basically, if there's a name in the corporate directory that matches the name of the machine, that must be real. And things that don't must not be. And as it turns out, that's wrong. But it is very much a time-saving heuristic, because going through all the other elements of systems is actually, that might not be worth the time. So it's a good strategy, but it's ultimately a problem, and it exposes them to some extra risk. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that in this case, I mean, people absolutely accept the veracity of telling them that deception is present. And this can be kind of a form of anchoring if you think about it that way. They get stuck on this idea, and we can kind of see in the later phase that, again, they do carry it over. So when we talk about cognitive bias, anchoring traditionally is a numeric kind of thing. If I ask you to think of the last 2 digits of your social security number and then have you estimate some quantity of something, or you end up being subconsciously influenced by your original number. It's a weird thing, and there's lots of other things like that people have shown in experiments. But there's also the conceptual aspect of anchoring, which is simply that the ideas that you encounter persist for a while. And I think in this case, the deception present is one of those. So in other words, people are told this kind of stuff, and then they continue on in trying to distinguish real from decoy because they're convinced that deception must be present. Yeah, you didn't tell me about it, and maybe I can't see it right now, but I'm sure it's here. It's got to be. There's some variance in the environment, and so people, much like there is in the real world, the network is not this static thing that with enough time you just know everything about, right? There are things that change. Software changes, patches happen, systems come up and down, servers spin up and down, services change. There's a never-ending stream of stuff, and this is the case as well. So again, we tend to see this kind of rationalization, the use of a heuristic that ends up, in this case, being a negative, and a type of anchoring here effect, pulling that information and experience over to other scenarios in the experiment. Another example here, and we have some forthcoming work that's really going to, I think, put a nail on this particular bias that unfortunately I couldn't get fully cleared, but I can at least tell you that we have work covering this in more detail in a different experiment, is the idea of confirmation bias. And here, from this experiment, we were able to see that this idea of actually figuring out what's real versus what's not involves a fair bit of this. So in addition to the fact that they use a heuristic to kind of nail down which trait they're going to focus on, they start using really faulty logic for determining whether something is real or not. So basically, they accept this proposition that if all hosts look like this, if all the real ones look like this and all the fake ones look like something else, then to see if something is fake, I just need to look for like the other option. And confirmation bias is all about not actually testing your beliefs. It feels like you are, but really all you're doing is confirming what you think you know. And there's not a whole lot of testing going on here. And in that exact fashion, people did not test that relationship between host name and corporate directory correctly. They just, once they thought that was the case, they just looked for confirmation of it. They didn't try to test it. And as it turns out, if they had, maybe they would have figured out that that wasn't necessarily the case. So it's kind of a mixed bag here, because certainly confirming their own beliefs in this case led to a bad outcome. But if they had stopped to disconfirm it, that would have then taken more time. So it's almost like a double bind. I mean, the defenders like both of those cases, right? Either one is going to reveal them, or it's going to make the attacker spend more time in the network, and both of that is good. So I already explained this idea of the first dot last name corporate directory stuff. And again, people are making this determination in confirmation of their prior knowledge. It really makes it hard for them to learn about things, which I think has an implication in general for attackers. If you give them the feeling of early confidence and early knowledge, then getting them to disconfirm things and really think scientifically and testing, it can be harder, right? Especially if there's high confidence. I actually think, for the most part, defenders and attackers in cyber have been trained to try to avoid this, but it's just such a persistent bias. And it's actually like several others in psychology that we know, even when you're told about these kinds of mistakes and you're told, hey, don't do this, you still do. And there's good evidence for that as well. And in the final example, let's move on to this third phase. This actually should read phase 3, apologies. where, again, people have been through two scenarios now that have had deception and have even been told about it, but now they're in one that has none of that. So this is a fully real network. There's nothing trying to trap them, nothing trying to get them, but yet they're inferring the presence of this stuff. And so you can look at this again as a type of anchoring or a type of framing, but the framing in this particular sense is actually about printers. So we had a number of people commenting in the experiment about printers originally with the assumption of no, potential deception. Printers are a really great target. They tend to be vulnerable. They tend to contain useful information. They might be good pivot points. But with the information of, hey, there might be deception here, now it's easy to look at printers as a potential loss. So if printers are fake, then they're almost like this excellent fake target. Putting something like that up that's not real, knowing that it would naturally be their first inclination to touch it, it's kind of like, ooh, yeah, maybe that's not such a good idea. Like, maybe I should avoid those printers. And we actually saw that shift in people. When, again, in this third phase, like, there's no reason to do that. Printers are perfectly real and perfectly exploitable and would have been a good choice. So we can see some of this stuff carrying over. And so we have some really great quotes throughout, but I think one of them that really captures a lot of this is that essentially what this did is it takes people off task. The people are saying, I think right off the bat, we are swayed that being one of the very first tasks was to think about what was real and compare and contrast those things instead of just targeting the most interesting assets. We actually spent a bunch of time comparing them. So you get people to swerve from the goal of getting into the network and taking things into not wanting to get caught, which is always sort of a goal and sub-goal as part of that, and then getting wrapped up in how to not get caught. And actually, I think in a lot of ways, if you get people stuck in that loop in a way that you're able to monitor how effective they are at it, that's a pretty good defender strategy as well. So if you get people second guessing what's good and what's bad, then you might get more chaotic actions. And in some sense, as long as you've got good defenses, otherwise that might be a good thing. So people never really get to orchestrate a true progression to the network. All right, and then finally, I just want to mention that one of the things that we observed, and we've been interested in trying to do more work on this, is sort of this idea of bias progression, because once you get into these things, by the way, and if you go later and you look up cognitive biases, like what are all the cognitive biases, you're going to see this hilarious chart of like 140 of them. It's a great looking infographic. As it turns out, we started there too. About half of those are not real. And what I mean by that is like they're basically just somebody's subjective naming of something they think happens, whereas the other half are actually either scientifically derived or have some sort of evidence behind them and can be measured and are sort of a known quantity. But anyway, I digress. Our idea here is that all this stuff is still a pretty gray area. So like, how do you know that someone's in one type of effect or another type of bias or whatever it is? How do you know? We started to piece together through this experiment in particular that by the time they're in phase 3, they've actually been through several different types of biases or decision-making kinds of things. So from the very first instance, anybody assuming that there's deception or something present on the network has effectively been framed. They now have a different sense of what's good and what's not, what's valuable, what's risky. And this leads to a fixation on looking for those elements and maybe an ignorance of some assigned task. And that's kind of an anchoring thing, right? You've been led down into the anchoring bits. And now because you're stuck on that, in order to solve it, you try to leverage a heuristic about, hey, I want to make determining these things easy. So you rationalize using a very easy, just one property of the system must help us figure out what's real and what's not. And then now you're also stuck on those properties. And so if anything counters that, you're like, yeah, it's probably not really evidence against what I'm thinking. Like I'm pretty confident. And that's kind of this confirmation bias idea. So you can see how people work through a variety of these. And that's why oftentimes what we're trying to do in implementation or operationalization of these things is more about the left column of this, finding evidence that people are doing it and getting that locked down rather than the right column, and trying to be, hyper scientific and always, like, you can imagine trying to put some sort of machine learning algorithm like, oh, are they actually anchoring or are they not anchoring? It's like, I don't really care about that. I care about like what's happening because they're anchoring. So again, just food for thought here. So certainly since then, we've done a lot of other stuff. I'm going to show you a couple of new papers here in a second. One of the things that we've been really lucky to have access to is this Tularosa study. So this stuff, if you want to go read about it, there's actually some, there's two papers here published in Hicks, the main paper that describes the Tularosa study, and also an appendix that contains basically a very in-depth description of all the different data that was collected. Not necessarily full analysis, but certainly, if you're curious, oh, what did they collect? You can read that and check that out. But they got 139 professional red teamers. These are people who do this kind of thing for a living, brought them into networks, subjected them to various conditions of deception or not, and they collected an enormous amount of data. And so we are currently involved in analysis of this data in search of some of these other cognitive bias effects. So obviously going from like a very small study with text transcripts to an extremely large study with an enormous amount of things to look at, our confidence in finding these things goes up dramatically. So there's a lot of cool stuff coming on that one. We've also been lucky to conduct some of our own sort of oppositional human factors focused studies. So in some of these, what we're working on is how do you get a particular bias to manifest and what security situations get you to that. And so that's obviously a topic for another time, and hopefully I get to come back here and tell you all about that. But I think the bottom line here is that a lot of this change in perspective, trying to make things harder for people is tough for human factors folks. We're used to thinking, no, I got to make the system more usable and more and less likely to create problems and more reliable and all these things. And I think for attackers, we want to do the exact opposite. So I'll just leave you off with some of the newer work that we have out there. I think Matt may have already shared this paper where we look at some of the data from the affective states. So when people are in these various deceptive conditions, how does that affect things like frustration or confusion, which is really great. They're actually, believe it or not, there has not been a ton of work studying that. There's just been a lot of assumptions. I also got to work with Dirk van Bruggen looking at human factors in automating cyber operations. This is a huge thing that is definitely coming down the pike. And all of the stuff that we have learned in human factors about people interacting with autonomous or automated or AI, I don't care what word you put in here, but people interacting with systems that do stuff with potentially without their awareness or understanding absolutely needs to be leveraged as this stuff makes its way into cyber operations. So there's an interesting paper on that. And then just a few weeks ago, one of my students presented a talk at Human Factors on looking at the team cognition side of this, which is saying certainly there are individual level biases, but people do this task in teams. And so it's a question about what kinds of team level influences or team level biases we could study and what kinds of effects those might have. And when you think about disrupting maybe the attackers we're most concerned about, right? People with large amounts of resources and dangerous goals, they're going to be operating in teams. So thinking about the individual is a part of that, of course, but thinking about teams is actually very important as well. So with that, I'm happy to stop, and I'll take my slides down, but if you had a specific slide question, I'll just throw them back up again. But either way, I'm happy to sit around for a bit and chat and see what kind of reactions folks had to this.